Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young, licensed clinical social worker. This is a weekly podcast where we explore the strengths we have because of our sensitivity and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there. To the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers. This is episode 24. In this episode, my good friend Laura and I talk about the 20 years where we didn't talk to each other. And this really was primarily due to a relationship that we both had with a therapist. We'll talk more about it in the episode. But one of the things that we don't talk about very much is there's a friendship trauma that comes up for us when we have relationships. And I think what happens is we really don't learn how to deal with that trauma, and we bury the grief, and injury gets added onto injury. So a lot of what Laura and I are talking about in this episode is how do you do the repair work when you have friendship trauma? There are also seasons of relationships that we go through, and sometimes relationships are good for certain parts of our lives or certain seasons of our lives. One of the things that you'll hear in this episode is at the time that Laura and I had this breakup, most everything for me was about the rules. It wasn't about the relationship. It wasn't about trying to work through issues in the relationship. The way that I kind of organized everything was around rules. We didn't talk for 20 years. You can tell that didn't work out so good for me. And one of the things that happened was I gave Laura an ultimatum, and so did the therapist that we were both seeing. This is the first time that we've really talked about this breakup together, about the breakup. You know, we've talked about pieces of it. So as I was editing it, I left more pauses in than I normally do. I usually like to keep the conversation flowing, but I really wanted you to get a sense of how we kind of stop to pause and to think about things and to answer things. I really wanted you to have a kind of a real-time sense of what was going on. Some of the points that we talk about through this is the importance of owning our mistakes and apologizing in relationships. It can be really difficult having needs and being vulnerable, but when we can own that we've made a mistake and apologize for it, man, that sure goes a long way. We also talk about how we rebuilt trust and established safety. Some of the defenses that we used to keep distance after we met up after the breakup, but we really didn't restart our relationship, and then how it took time once we did reconnect to build that trust, that it's easy to say, I'm sorry, but I think actions speak louder than words, and it takes time to allow a person's behaviors to see if they're going to match with what they're saying. The other 2 points are, I think as highly sensitive people, because we process so deeply, we really have this process of evaluating and discerning, and I think that we often put negative language to it, thinking that we're being judgmental or being gossipy. But I think that it's really important to check things out and to provide feedback when these things come up for us. And the final thing is that Laura talks about is trust is the ability to work through conflict. I think this is really just a beautiful example of how we did some amazing repair work after having this really close relationship and then not talking for 20 years. I am going to post some pictures on Instagram of the time when we were in Europe, and I'm not sure what else, but if you want to jump over to my Instagram page, it's at Unapologetically Sensitive. And then at the end, I'm going to hop on, and I have a couple of thoughts about the relationship that we both had with this therapist that I think really had a pivotal point in not helping us to look at the relationship, and the therapist really made it about the rules as well. All right, so on to the show. Hey, Laura.
Hey, Patricia.
Welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here.
So I want to talk about why we're going to talk about our 20-year breakup today. And this is really the first time that we've talked about it. We've been in it, but we really haven't talked about it. I think it's just such a beautiful example of how we could have been so close. The ways that sometimes when we're not mature, we don't have enough information. For us, it was partially due to a therapist, a mutual therapist that we had, and just where we were at. And the fact that we have reconnected and have this beautiful, amazing relationship that really seems like it's even closer than we were when we'd been friends for years. And the work that we do in our relationship, in the same way that I love to model my vulnerability for the podcast, I think the work that we do in our relationship is an extension of that. And I really would love to give listeners an opportunity to kind of get a glimpse in how do you do repair work and how do you come back from something that felt like it was undoable. And I don't know if broken is the right word. What word would you use?
I don't know, because I don't know I ever anticipated it repairing.
Yeah.
That was a complete surprise, and so grateful for the repair, but I never anticipated it.
And I think so many of us have friendship wounds, and we don't really know how to do friendships. We don't know how to work through conflict. We don't know how to do the repair work. And I think we have so many wounds from relationships that didn't work out. And the other thing that I don't think anybody ever taught me is relationships go through seasons. And sometimes relationships are good for a certain part of our life, but they're not relationships that carry forward. And I think as women, sorry guys, as HSPs, you're included in this, guys, relationship and connection is so important to us. And I just don't think that there's that much information about how do we navigate through this stuff.
Right. And I feel like there are so many layers of processes that we could talk about, but one of them being just what you said, we're not role modeled how to repair. We're not taught how to negotiate our needs. We're not taught to look at what wounding might be getting triggered around this. And I'm not sure if this is the right place for it, but we didn't have anyone assisting us in it. So we were just kind of acting out and doing the best we could with what we had, which is what the breakup was just a reflection of us not knowing how to do it any differently and not having the support to do it differently.
Yeah, the skills or the support.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I don't know, what would you hope that people would get from listening to this episode?
So one of the things that I've noticed over this is that there is a lot of friendship trauma that I have in my entire life. And so being a therapist, being in therapy, I processed a ton of family of origin trauma, childhood trauma, but never, ever realized that there was friendship trauma. And so our relationship and the repair work has allowed me to go back and look at some of those traumas and process them differently. So I guess what I would hope that people could take away from looking at what narratives might have gotten activated from some of their breakups that they've had or relationship difficulties that they've had, and knowing that sometimes repair is possible, but healing can be possible whether there's a repair or not.
Yeah. Laura, why don't you take a few minutes and introduce yourself and let listeners know a little bit about you?
My name is Laura Carr. I am one of my careers is I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I have been practicing since 97. It is something I love deeply. I started a nonprofit called Center for Mindful Relationships in 2012, and it is a counseling agency that offers counseling services to individuals, couples, and families. And we have a variety of therapists that work there for us. And then I also have another career where I offer health and wellness products to the community, which is totally different than anything I've ever done before, which is really fun. And then I've been married for 20 years this year and have two amazing sons who just brighten my day every day. Pets and friendships and social and all sorts of good stuff.
Thank you. So our 20-year breakup. So back in the 90s we met and we were best friends.
Yes.
And then you went away to study in Bristol for a year. And after that first year, I went to Europe, and you and I traveled for 3 weeks through Europe together.
Right. Really fun. I don't even know how many years we'd been developing a friendship, but we were really close.
We were very close. I mean, you were definitely my best friend.
And same, you were my best friend. We were, spent holidays together. We just did stuff together all the time. And so when you came over, 96, I think?
95, I think.
Patricia is very good with details. So you came over and it didn't surprise me, but it was one of those extension of love that you would come over. I mean, you came over and my sister and my mother came over, but I think it was a big deal for you to come over to Europe, and we spent 3 weeks together and we traveled to seven different countries.
Yeah.
It was fantastic. It was so much fun.
Yeah, it was. Except for the fact that you could read when we were on the bus and I couldn't, and that wasn't very fair because I get car sick.
There was that.
Yeah.
When I came back, you were not in a relationship before I left, were you?
I think in 95. Oh, I got back from Europe and I felt like I was so messed up that no one would ever, ever love me. I should save this. My husband said he's going to be on the podcast. You know what? I'm going to hold this story because this morning Steve said that he would be on the podcast. So I'm going to save this story.
Oh, that's fun.
So anyways, I came back and my husband and I got together.
To be continued on a different podcast up there. When I came back, I was in your wedding, and I still have the dress from that wedding.
I know. That's amazing. That's amazing.
So it's, even though we had a breakup, I had like a hidden friendship stash of stuff that I had picked up, along the time of our friendship that I couldn't get rid of.
And that's interesting because I've had so much loss and abandonment in my life that I get rid of things. I obviously cannot internally get rid of things, but that's one of my defense mechanisms. If you're a boyfriend, I break up with you. Everything you gave me, bye-bye. So I got rid of everything that was related to our relationship because that's how I handled loss.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I was in your wedding, and you were married in
97.
Yes.
Yeah. We had the same therapist. We both went through a treatment center for eating disorders. You went through before I did. But as a result, we had the same therapist. It was not uncommon. There were kind of a group of us and we all shared the same therapist. And really, it worked out fine. I know that there's often a lot of discussion in the therapy community about can friends see the same therapist, with the exception of what happened with this particular therapist, which I wouldn't recommend what happened. There really wasn't any problem with it. And we would often compare notes about, well, so-and-so said this and the therapist said that, and it really wasn't an issue.
No, wasn't an issue.
Yeah.
Let's see. So I'm not quite sure how much to share.
I can do it if you want.
Okay, go for it.
So around 1998, something happened, and we're not going to go into what happened because it's really not relevant to the story. But we were seeing the same therapist, and from my perspective, an ethical issue arose. And from the therapist's perspective, an ethical issue arose. From your perspective, there wasn't an ethical issue.
No.
20 years later, looking back, there was no ethical issue. And I'm really, really clear about that. Given my history of rules having rules and not knowing about making room for the relationship and having a therapist, I'll let you speak a little bit more to that part of it. That I saw a rule and it looked like you were breaking the rule. And with my rigidity, that just wasn't okay. And having a therapist that corroborated that by omission, it felt like you were breaking a rule and that was not acceptable.
Right. And this therapist talked with me about this thing that was going on in my life and took a stand on it and basically gave me an ultimatum, and I chose what was going on in my life rather than to continue therapy. And there was no processing of it. There was just the rule. And so it was either or. And then I sequentially, I don't know how things happened. And then we ended up having a conversation and that same thing happened.
I gave you an ultimatum. And it's interesting that, and we'll talk about this more as the story progresses, but when we reconnected 20 years later, I had forgotten that I had given you that ultimatum, and my husband reminded me, and then I asked you about it. You're like, oh, yeah. And my ultimatum to you was?
To choose this thing in my life or the friendship.
And I feel mortified hearing that. I mean, really, Laura and I are in the same room recording, and I have my eyes closed because really, I feel a lot of shame about that. I mean, it was the best that I could do at the time. And given the skill set that I have now, like, what was I thinking? And it felt like it was about a rule. A rule had been broken and that, you had to, it just like, and so much of what I talk about with my kids these days and what you and I talk about is it's about the relationship. It's about the process and being able to work through anything and knowing that the relationship can tolerate that. Boy, back then it was all about the rules. It was so not about the relationship or about our needs or what came up for us. It was about you broke a rule and that wasn't okay.
Right. And we shared a therapist that supported you in that mindset. So there was no processing of anything gray.
Right. And what that looked like was I would talk about this is wrong and the therapist would not respond. And if I asked, what do you think? The response was, what do you think? Which felt like that was agreement. It wasn't, I always feel nervous saying this stuff. I could see myself as a therapist today interjecting and giving feedback about where I feel like the line is drawn. If I had a client that was struggling, I just would do it so differently. I don't know that I would, I don't know. I always feel like I dig myself into a hole. I'm much more vocal about things and would work with the client, but I cannot imagine handling a situation with a client in the same way that it was done with us.
Well, and to be really frank, the therapist was wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
She was flat out wrong.
Yeah.
And so I have no clue where she was getting her coaching from, her mentoring, her whatever, but she was just wrong. So whatever way she was being with you and with me was coming from an uninformed place. So how could that not lead to confusion? And yet, we often talk, we don't know what was going on with her. Right. We sometimes digress into making up stories about what it was, but really we have no idea. And so the interesting piece was, I can still picture the conversation sitting on the couch in the little studio, that I rented back then. Mm-hmm. And I remember the conversation. I don't remember
with me.
With you.
Yeah.
Like, I even remember, this is a detail I do remember. I remember where you sat on the couch and where I sat on the couch, but I don't remember like how it ended. Like, did you just walk out and leave? Like, I don't know. I guess, so the thing was, the event that I had in my life, what I had was a relationship that I could go to get support. Mm-hmm. So while there was a lot of grief and loss happening, I don't know, there was a lot of grief. What I did is I turned more into my relationship. So it
drew you two closer.
It drew us two closer. It gave us something to come closer about.
Right.
Yes.
And I had nothing.
Right.
Which I didn't even realize until you and I had talked 20 years later. So I remained with the therapist. Obviously, you didn't. Did this therapist talk to me about what it was like to lose my best friend? No. Did the therapist help me look at ethics and rules and explore critical thinking and options? No. And I think given where I was at emotionally at the time, everything was about rules. It wasn't about what I was feeling about it. Right. So I think those feelings just got buried. And I think that's where we tend to get relationship trauma.
Right.
The way that I dealt with it is get rid of everything that had to do with you. And like, that's over now. It was about a rule. You broke a rule.
Right.
There was nothing about what it brought up for me and the tremendous loss because you were my best friend.
Right. We spent a lot of time together. We worked out together. We played together. We did crafts together. Even in your relationship, like I never felt like a third wheel. Like we just hung out together all the time.
Yeah, the three of us. I remember on Christmas Day, we went hiking to the top of, it wasn't Mount Woodson.
Oh my gosh, no. Something peak.
Machu Picchu?
Something.
Across from Green Valley Falls, whatever that is. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you were a part of our relationship, the three of us, and we just had this really close friendship, and then all of a sudden, boom.
Right. And it's interesting because, like, when we talk about holding on to things, it's one of the ways I process. Like, I hide them away, I put them away. But, like, you made me the
The Christmas stocking?
Thank you. Stocking. I could picture it, right? You made me a stocking and I never hung it, but it was always in my Christmas, right, gear. So I would bring it out every year and I would feel the pain, but I would just keep it, hidden away. The dress would be in the back corner of my closet. There were a few other little things that I can't think of right now. I do remember consciously putting my albums like up in the attic so that I wouldn't like look at them because you're in a big chunk of those pictures.
Yeah.
And so that's a cool thing that you did not throw away is there are pictures still.
Right. I have all of our Europe pictures and Mo was in them because Mo was living in London at the time. And so we went and saw cats when Mo was there. We've got pictures of the three of us. Yeah, I did not get rid of those. I was just thinking, do you remember that kitschy we had? It was like a frog made out of seashells, one of those really kitschy, yucky things. And we had this thing that when we'd go over to the other person's house, we would hide it somewhere because it was this really tacky, like he was playing a banjo or something, with the googly eyes. I must have had it because I don't know where it is. I probably threw it out.
It wasn't until you brought it up at one point that I had totally forgotten about it.
Yeah. But it was always, it would be a surprise that I'd go to get towels out or, I'd go to reach for something and then there would be this,
there it is.
This shell frog guy playing the banjo.
Yes. And, it's that place of, well, I think you mentioned this earlier, like we moved into, my husband and I moved into our house in 1997 or 8. I'm horrible at details.
I think we moved into our house in 98.
I think it was the spring of 98 that we moved into our house.
Yeah. And your house is 5 blocks away from my house. So for 20 years, we lived 5 blocks away from each other. Mm-hmm. And at some point, we knew that.
I didn't know where you lived because the house that when we were connected, you lived in a different house not too far. Mm-hmm. I can't remember how I found out.
I think about 2002 because you and I met at the voting polls and Joshy was with me and he was 2 or 3. So 2002, 2003. I think at that point we talked about where we lived.
Right. Yes, that was that awkward. Like, holy
awkward.
Smokes. And I think you were in front of me.
Yeah. Yeah. That thing when you run into someone that you don't want to talk to. Hi, how are you? It's so nice to see you. And inside you're just thinking, oh, Lordy, Lordy, Lordy.
Exactly. I was very active around, and I can remember like once I found out where you lived, driving by the street, but no longer felt free to like walk down it, even though I had done that before because when I didn't know, now it was like, that's the street,
Yeah.
And oddly, we didn't run into each other very often.
I know it's crazy. Well, every time I'd go to Whole Foods, I was sure I was going to run into you. Like I dread it. Yeah. And I'm like, never ran into you.
Yeah.
But somehow at one point, I know that I went over to your house and we talked. I think it was shortly after we ran into each other at the voting polls. Oh. And we talked and then nothing came of it.
I don't remember that.
And I had to make up stories in my head about why it wasn't going to work to be friends with you. Like I kind of defaulted back to that whole rule thing. And that was a defense against feeling the loss and making it about the relationship of having to go to something external. And what my thing was to go to a rule and to make up a story about why it wouldn't work for us to be friends in my head.
Right. And I think I had a relationship to focus on, and then we got married, and then, we traveled, and I was building a business, and I was getting licensed, and then we had children, and so it was easy for the grief to get buried and to grieve, but not really spend much time on it because it was like it was just an injury, and nothing was going to happen. So you just move on.
So I missed your courtship, your wedding. You missed me having twins, my kids being raised. I missed your kids being born and your kids being raised until we reconnected.
Right.
Yeah. So about 2017, I left my job at the hospital and started private practice. And so then I got on Facebook and we were in a couple of the same Facebook groups and I saw your name and we would maybe post in the same thread, but like kind of two dogs kind of, in the same yard. not sniffing each other, but just kind of knowing that, like you're there kind of far away.
Right. And I can remember like going, crap, right? Because like I just never anticipated, with you being an LCSW, and me, what I knew about you back then was, your work was more sign language, all of that. So I just never anticipated our therapy worlds coming together. And so I can remember like not knowing what to do about that and not talking about it, just like thinking, I guess, kind of hoping it would just like go away. Mm-hmm. And then... Mm-hmm.
And then I did a promotional video because I'd started private practice, and I did a Facebook Live. And in the middle of a Facebook Live, your name pops up with some kind of supportive statement. And if you go back and you watch that video, you can totally see that I got a little teary, I got a little choked up. And I'm doing this live with someone else. And like that was the first time that like you had acknowledged me. Like you had acknowledged my presence, and whatever you said was something nice and supportive. And I just remember feeling like,
Right. And, it's interesting, even though I just said a second ago that I was hoping it would go away, one of the strengths that comes with my makeup is that I want to connect, and it's easy for me to forgive. I don't use the word forgiveness lightly because... or not lightly. I don't use it intentionally because forgiveness has a whole connotation around it in our society. And but it is easy for me to make peace around things when people show up. There is this desire to connect and heal and move on and repair. And so I think I had this duality going on of like, not wanting it to move on just because I didn't know what you were going to do. And I don't remember this like explicitly, but I can remember when you did the live, like I went to my own like vulnerability around doing a live, and it just popped up on it's not like I was searching for it. It just popped up when I happened to be on. And that heartfelt presence of wanting to support, like I didn't have to fake it. I didn't have to force it. It was just a natural desire to support. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what led to...
Yeah. So we had made a plan to connect and go for a walk at some point after that. I would say probably relatively shortly. So we had connected, and I think we had a nice connection. It felt sweet. You didn't want to process anything that had happened from your perspective, like you dealt with it. It was all fine. And this was the first time when you mirrored to me that you had somebody to process the whole thing with. And it had never even occurred to me how kind of abandoned I was. I mean, I gave you an ultimatum and I left the relationship, or I didn't give you a choice. But like in my own therapeutic process, I was abandoned. I didn't know to talk about it. I didn't know what to talk about. And none of that was discussed.
Right. And I think my initial, like, I don't want to process this was, and again, none of this was really conscious. I can remember going out for the walk and telling my husband, like, I'm going, I don't know, we'll see. And kind of expecting it to like hook up and then just, okay, yep, that's not going to work. And then we could wrap it up and put it to bed. And I think there was this protective nature for me of like, I don't want to get vulnerable. And I wasn't consciously in this place of like, I'm not going to get vulnerable. But looking back, when we would reflect and talk about it, it was, I don't trust you yet.
And rightfully so.
Right.
I mean, why should you have? And I made it about a rule and not about a relationship. And I gave you an ultimatum. So why would you have trusted?
Right. And I think my history can be that I trust too soon and get hurt. And so there was that place of what I love about that characteristic of like wanting to repair is I want to come in and connect. And there was a place that I think was really healthy to say, we'll see. Let's see how this goes. And being cautious. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's funny because I'm not going to say too much. I'm going to wait for this episode with my husband. But my husband talks about like him waiting for me, which I totally didn't really get. And I kind of had that with you. Like I had a vision of where I wanted the relationship to be. And I felt like I can wait this out. I can give you the time that you need and I can be patient. And it wasn't until you had your knee replacement
Right.
that it really felt like this is an opportunity because I really shine at showing up and being supportive. And you have a really hard time asking for help and asking for support.
Right.
And so it really was a beautiful opportunity for me to really show up for you in a way that I hadn't been able to. And for some reason, I had the courage to talk about your resistance to let me be there for you.
Right. And I felt like it was a really slow, I guess if you look back, someone might say that was really fast, but I feel like we didn't rush it. Mm-hmm. Life circumstances allowed us to connect in deeper ways. And so who would have known that 6 months earlier when I ruptured my ACL, that would be what helped, or, what that timely piece, because it just seemed like such a beautiful timing of having the surgery. Then that was which happened first, the party or the ACL surgery?
It may have, I don't know.
Because I feel like I want to say like that was also really huge, because I threw this screw shame party, like to really looking at facing down shame messages. And it was like a playful way to let you in. And you came in and helped me hang lights in my backyard. And we went shopping at Costco. And I got the chance to let someone, be there for me. Like it's often really hard. I'm a person who, like, if I can handle it, I'd much rather handle it myself than. And there's, I think, that place, if I look at friendship trauma, of expecting to be disappointed or expected to be hurt or expected to be judged or, whatever. And so I feel like we had these baby steps of building safety.
Yeah.
And then the ACL surgery was huge, where you came over and brought food, and it was and picked up, I think you picked up our son.
I think I did.
One time. I mean, it was just all these like little ways to just come in a little closer and a little closer.
And we've talked about this, like the gift that I give is, and I can never remember, I should go back and listen to my own episode of the 5 love languages, but I'm really good at showing up emotionally, but I'm not so great about showing up with stuff and gifts. Like that's just not, I feel like I don't know what to do, and you have to tell me. And it's kind of a terrible thing, because when we're in that place where we need someone, we often don't know what we need and we can't articulate it. So, but for some reason, it was really clear for me that I brought you food, and I asked if your son needed to be picked up. And it was really easy for me to show up for you in a way that was meaningful and helpful.
Right. And it was so meaningful because, and I think had we begun poloing?
No.
Not yet. Okay. So I can remember we talked about the difficulty of me receiving and could I practice receiving. And so it was a place of, we had begun to navigate this safety in the relationship and vulnerability, in it. And like without us talking about the injury from the past, like you asked, kind of in a way saying, let me show you that I can be trustworthy.
Yeah, and it's funny because I do remember kind of thinking that I'm just going to have to keep showing up to earn your trust, and I understood that. And I don't think I've ever experienced that in a relationship before, or ever made a conscious choice like, I'm just going to keep showing up in the best way that I know how.
Right. And we didn't, it's not like we talked every bit of this out. I can't remember when we began to take the walks, but I can remember us talking about like the walk on the corner, and I'm like, yeah, I processed it. I'm good. And I remember like how healing, let's see, I think what's really challenging for me is I haven't had a lot of relationships where they've owned the part that they contributed to it. And so there was fear in that. And I can't remember exactly when it happened, but I think it was on a walk, or maybe it was on the corner.
It was the first time we got together.
Was it?
Yeah, because I feel like I'm really good about owning my stuff. And that's when I had talked to my husband prior to us getting together, and he had reminded me that I gave you that ultimatum, and I apologized and said that I was so sorry, and I was so embarrassed that I did that, and I'd actually forgotten it. Because I know that I'm really good about, if I make a mistake, I'm going to own it.
Right. And I just remember like that feeling so good and not knowing what to do with that. because there's that place of newness. And yeah, what does that mean? Like, what next?
Well, and yeah, so you're saying that, but you need to show me with your behavior that you mean it. Like, the words are nice, but based on your past behavior, I don't really have a lot to go on with that. You need to show up and show me that you mean it.
So absolutely, yes. And I also feel like not a lot of people do it without a yeah, but, or the rationalization or the reason why you did it. There's something really powerful in being able to just own something without any excuses. Yeah. And, to me, it's something, it was the first time I think I'd ever experienced it from someone, and especially about something that it was a really big deal.
It was a huge deal.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, we're sitting here together, and when I think about it, I almost like, I know I did it. I know I didn't know any better. And it still to this day, sitting in this room with my best friend talking about it, like, it still feels crummy. Like, man, I didn't know how to do it any differently. And I'm like, even to this day, like, I'm really sorry.
Right. And, and I still do believe this, even though I know there was some defensiveness around it. I really do believe everything that happens to us becomes a part of our journey. I'm not one of those who believes everything happens for a reason. Mm-hmm. I don't mean it that way. I mean it allowed me, I then made of it what I made of it. And I was able to, it had the benefits of in my relationship. And, so I think I was protecting myself from the hurt by going to the strengths, and the strengths were still there. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to recognize both. Mm-hmm. And I think when you were able to acknowledge what you did, I was then able to then feel the pain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm trying to think. So I know you had the party. I know throwing the party was really hard for you. Having attention was hard for you. And like, again, I'm really good with the organization and the stepping in. Like, parties are not my thing. Parties with people that I don't know, parties at other people's houses, not really my thing. This is kind of the equivalent of what we talked about in another episode about when I talked about being a highly sensitive person and you sort of had the internal eye roll, but out of love for me, you didn't do it and you just wanted to learn more.
Right.
It was kind of the same thing of, I know that I can show up for you this way. Not really what my favorite way of showing up is, but because I cared about you and the relationship and wanted to support you, I was able to show up. And here's a hack for all of you highly sensitive people or people that don't like parties and groups, is if you have a role for me, if I get there before other people get there, so I don't get overwhelmed by the crowds. And if I have a role and a task to do, it makes it much easier as opposed to feeling like I have to stand around and be social and meet people, because that small talk thing, not so good at it.
Right. Right. So I feel like in the ways we walked through something really uncomfortable that had nothing to do with each other, but together. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think when we started to use the app Marco Polo, which we talk about all the time, and I'm still not getting any money for it. I know it was really difficult for me initially to use it. So if you're not familiar, it's an app called Marco Polo. And I call it poloing. If I'm poloing Laura, then I'm recording myself on video. If she's watching, she can give a heart or a thumbs up or a prayer sign, but it's not interactive. So it means that I'll polo Laura and then Laura can polo me back. And I remember the weekend that you started doing it, you were doing laundry. You were sitting on the floor in your house folding laundry and talking, and I had dirty hair. That's right. I was feeling sad. I felt like I don't want to be on video with dirty hair. I wasn't dressed. And I was I was just having a lot of feelings. And I don't know how I got the courage, but I poloed you and I was crying, which felt really vulnerable. I think with my history of feeling that my feelings are too much, I'm too much, people can't handle me. And so that feeling of like, I'm going to show you my underbelly and you're not going to respond and I'm going to be too much.
I'm so glad. I totally forgot. I'm actually trying to scroll through my Marco Polos to see if I can find the first one. But so here's another fun thing that I know about myself is when I get excited about something, I jump right in. Mm-hmm. And so when I poloed you, like, yeah, you were so like, oh, no. And pretty quickly you came around. But I just remember that how fun it was. And then when we fell into it, it became this really magical thing.
There's something so powerful about this app, Marco Polo. It's not the app, it's really the process. And I know what you've reflected to me is that often I'll polo you about something and I'm having a dilemma and I'm asking for your feedback and I don't know what to do. But because nobody's interrupting and I just get to talk, I usually end up coming around to whatever the solution to my question was, because I get a chance to talk it through and to process, and you can see if the other person is watching or not. There's a little icon that shows up of the other person. So you have an idea of if they're watching or not. I think we just went to a whole new level of intimacy once we started to use the app.
Yes. And what we've reflected over time, what is it? It's so interesting. And what I've also found is because you can't respond while I'm recording or I can't respond while you're recording, there's a built-in protection to just process or talk about whatever you're talking about. So sometimes you'll be like, you want to get on a phone call? I'm like, nope, I'd rather just have my little protective little cave where I get to talk about my experience. And it's been really fascinating for me that the process of watching myself. So I think you can, if you choose, learn to fall in love with yourself while you watch yourself through the process of wherever you're at. Then there's the process of listening to yourself out loud while you know this person is going to also listen. Then there's that at least the way we polo, you reflect whatever's going on, and then you talk about whatever's going on for you, and then I get that process to do it for you. It just is it's just set up in such a beautiful way, at least the way we use it, to be healing, supportive, loving, kind, spacious, forgiving, gentle.
And what I see happening with the process is, and this happened recently, that I poloed you one night. I told you about something, you poloed me back, and then I poloed you again because I was upset and heard about something that happened on social media. It's all I have to say. And so I said, I want you to come back and say that this is unfair. And, I should, I wanted some support around it. And the next morning I woke up and you had texted me and I texted back what are you talking about? And you were responding to my request for support about, this thing that I was ranting about. And I think because, I'm so comfortable with my feelings and just feeling it and putting it out there and moving on, I'm not ruminating about stuff. And so a couple of times you'll respond about something and I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot I was even talking about that. That just that process of being able to talk about whatever's going on and then let it go.
Right.
And I think for us, if we're sensitives, we tend, we're deep thinkers and we tend to kind of hold on to things, sometimes ruminate and have a hard time letting things go. And if we're doing it, there's no judgment with that. But I really find that having a process where I'm okay with my feelings, I accept them, and I don't apologize. I'll call you a lot of the time. I'll go okay, I have a snark moment, and I'll about something. And it moves that energy so that I don't feel like I live in that place of feeling snarky.
So exactly so. And Patricia and I, you and I talk about this a lot, the difference of how we talk about things. So if you were talking, we each do this place of the snark moments. If we talked about it, believing what we were talking about as being the truth, then all we do is reinforce it versus having a moment, right? And we talk about it and it just releases, it releases us from the energy. And I love that experience of coming back of, oh, yeah, that happened. I didn't even realize that it happened. It's that process that we've created in our relationship to just not dump it. It's just naming it, releasing it. And because we can share it in that way, I get a window into it. So it's intimate. You don't actually even need anything. But the fact that then I respond to it, I think it's also healing and kind because you feel invested in, even though you didn't need it.
Right. And it's almost like a mindful type of communication. So an example would be the difference of me going, can you believe that Mary blah, 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 and Mary blah, 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 and Mary blah, blah, blah. That's kind of being in it.
Right.
But what'll happen is I'll go, snark moment. Can you believe that Mary blah, 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 and it's just irritating me and I don't like when she does this. I'm owning it. I'm owning that I'm having judgment. I'm owning that I'm having a snark moment. As opposed to living in it, I have that ability to remove myself from being in it and say, I'm being judgy right now, and I'm judgy McJudge.
Right. And then I'll respond and sometimes I might go, oh, that sucks that Mary, I can't believe how that would feel, rather than saying, yeah, Mary is a da-da-da-da, and I can't believe and we should do something about that, and keeping it focused on whatever she did or didn't do or said or didn't say.
Or my worst nightmare would be you coming back and going like, I don't like you gossiping.
Right.
Having judgment for being where I'm at, because I feel like I got a lot of negative feedback about being gossipy. And what I've come to realize is that being a highly sensitive person, because we process so deeply, it's almost like a process of discernment and needing to talk about the judgments and the things that come up so that I can kind of figure out and sort through it. I mean, if somebody needs to call it gossip, then call it gossip. But it's really been helpful for me in having that reframe that I really need to talk about those things, because it sort of helps me filter through and understand it. And then I kind of let go of it and I don't hang on to it.
Right. I think to me, and because I do have a value system about not gossiping. And the difference to me is if we didn't name it in the way that we do, then it might be gossiping and unhelpful. But the way we talk about it is, yeah, it can be judgmental. It can be, but where we go with it, to me, is healing and releasing, and doesn't hold any energy back towards that other person, even if I have energy about the event that happened. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that makes sense.
My brain is tired. It went offline.
I understand. Well, and you know what I wanted to say is, like, I wanted to come back to, because I feel like we do this a lot, is we'll start talking on one thing and then we end up somewhere else, is where our relationship is now is I just feel really grateful for. So it's been a year and a half?
I think in September it'll be 2 years.
Okay.
August.
Okay. So a year and a half, we're coming up on 2 years.
Yeah.
We're gonna have to come up with a name of like, when like a band breaks up and they get back together.
Mindful reunion
of just the is a miraculously, I don't even know how to talk about it, in our own journeys. Even though we haven't been connecting for 20 years, like it's like we've had very because how we view the world, what excites us, how we talk about things, how we process is so incredibly similar. And our strengths line up with each other as well, like our strengths and our challenges. It just, to me, is really a beautiful, just a beautiful reunion.
It feels like we've been on a parallel process.
Parallel process, that's the word. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I know for me, a lot of it is having the courage and the willingness to tell the truth about what I see, and to be really honest and vulnerable about what's going on. I mean, I think I'd love to do more episodes with you about this, because I think it's so powerful. But, even today, you and I were talking, and you've been sick for a couple of weeks. Well, two things, actually. That with you getting sick and not being as available, my kids are out of the house. You've got way more going on. Because we polo so frequently, and I knew that you were sick, we had a time where we weren't talking as frequently via Marco Polo. We haven't really had a chance to walk for a number of reasons. And I could feel my attachment injuries coming up. Like, my adult knew everything's fine and we're secure, but I really kind of got in touch with what I could imagine it felt like for me as a kid, with my mom not being available and having that need to connect, but being able to tell you about it. And even though you were sick, it wasn't like you're wrong for not being here to attend to my needs. It was just saying, hey, this is what I noticed that's coming up. And I mean, how was it for you hearing that?
I feel like because we've been doing it from the beginning, since we've reconnected, it's just what we do. We just talk about what's going on for us, and both of us are really good at not personalizing it. And if we get triggered, we're really good about coming back and saying we got triggered.
Yeah.
We've had a couple of instances. Remember when you gave me feedback about something about being entitled?
Yeah. And I meant it in a totally complimentary way, and it triggered you.
Right. And so I think it was on a walk, and then I poloed you later about being triggered and didn't realize I was triggered. And then we talked about it.
Yeah.
And I got to see what that was really about. And so I feel like we've created a safety in being able to just talk. And we'll often say, I'm going to say something. Let me know if it doesn't land right. Let's talk about, and there's always that commitment to working it out.
Right. You know what I had forgotten? Do you remember in the very beginning when we started reconnecting, because we had that fear of like, oh my gosh, what if something happens? And our joke was, so what's the worst thing? Like, we've already been to the worst place. Like, okay, so we don't talk for another 20 years. I mean, I had forgotten, but we joked about that initially because there was that fear of what if we have another rupture? And it's like, well, kind of the worst thing that could have happened has already happened and we lived through it. So there's really not too much of a worse place that we could go.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is really reassuring.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, okay, so let's just deal with whatever comes up.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, what a lot of relationships fear. They fear the worst and they don't know that they can survive it.
Well, or they don't want to talk about things because it's going to bring up conflict and it's going to be uncomfortable. And I think when it's about the process of the relationship, that I can talk to you about whatever I need to talk to you about and know that we will be able to handle the conflict and work through it, then there's not any content that we can't talk about.
Right, because trust is the ability to work through conflict. That's one really important aspect of trust.
Right. But I think so many relationships, people don't want to rock the boat. If I bring up something that's going to upset you, we're going to have conflict, we're not going to be able to work through it, or we're just going to go through the same cycle that we go through every time. And so we end up, not us, but in relationships, people end up not having intimacy because it's about the content and not about the process. Let's talk about it and we can work through whatever we work through.
Right. And it might be fun to do another podcast where we talk about the specific skill sets that are required in order to do what we do. Mm-hmm. Right. So there's an awareness of, just to name a few, there's to have an awareness of what your own personal triggers are, to know that there's a narrative being driven, to know that there's emotions getting triggered, to be able to name all of that and be able to talk about it in a way that doesn't blame.
And to be able to own your stuff.
Exactly.
Own it in two ways. For me, if I make a mistake, to own it and apologize, and to say, like, this is a hot spot for me.
Right.
I have abandonment issues. So when I don't hear from you, that triggers my abandonment issues. And you and I have both said, like, I haven't heard from you. Like, I know I'm in a secure relationship, but are you angry? Is something going on with you? That just warms my heart. And oftentimes, like, if you're the one that's saying it, I'll pick up and it's like, hey, I'm just in the middle of doing something. I'm here. It's all good. And I'll touch base with you later. And the fact that you can share that that's going on with you, because it wouldn't even occur to me, like, I'm just busy doing something right now.
Right. And it's so interesting because on the flip side, it's that place of when I don't have anything going on and I'm waiting for you to respond. That's that space where how I talk about is the voices. We talk about the gremlins, right? Those voices kick in and want to activate the insecurity. And so if we don't know to just check that out and we don't have a relationship where it's safe to check things out, then we can't put that story to bed. Mm-hmm. And then it informs what we do next.
Or on the days that you're working and I have a quieter schedule, I'll polo you and I'll look down and I see, like, holy, this is the third or fourth polo. And I'll say, like, I feel like I'm being too much, or, you're going to be overwhelmed. And you always come back and say, I love having polos from you. And I love, too, that you will polo me back and say, hey, I haven't had a chance to watch your polos. Like, we don't have a rule about, well, you have to watch everything and respond to it. That we just kind of have a very spontaneous relationship.
Right. It's such a thing, too, is it feels really easy in the friendship. And so things that feel reassuring to you, I'll be like, it feels so easy. And then when I'll say thank you about something, and again, you'll say the same thing, that's just so easy. And so I guess I feel like that is a reflection of a lot of work that both of us have done individually, that those skills can now show up really easily here. But for the listeners who might be struggling with some of that internal, maybe they're not, them or their other relationships haven't done that inner work, or they're still in the middle of it, to know that it's a journey. Because, if someone's already, on the other side of something. For the person who's still trying to get through that middle stage, it can feel really hopeless or depressing, like I'll never get there.
Right.
And so I guess I'm wondering if your listeners would find it helpful to talk about what are some of the concrete steps, like what would that look like? Because it's not about a behavioral change. It's about a change in orientation to how you show up with yourself, which then allows you to be vulnerable within the relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the other thing is really learning how to mirror other people, and
which means being okay with yourself.
Right. So for me, I've got a lot of my attachment and abandonment issues are feeling like I'm being too much, but you'll often say like, I feel like I'm whining about this.
Right.
And I'll reflect back like, hey, if I was going through that, I'd be really upset. And let's reframe it. It's not whining. You're talking about what's not working out. And so I think that ability to mirror and to reframe in a positive way, because I think so many of us have heard the two, whatever it is, and we've internalized that. And then we feel like we're stuck in it and we continue to beat ourselves up when we're really showing up with amazing strengths. But sometimes it helps when we have somebody else that can reflect back to us that, like you're not whining, or you're not too much. Or I love when you always say like, talk to me at the end, like, okay, I'm not being too much. You want to hear more from me. It's
right.
Healing.
Interesting thing is we often choose relationships that will bring up the narrative from our childhood wounding. Not all relationships will
have the capacity to do the work
they'll
that we're
capacity
doing.
to do that, or they'll actually reflect the two.
Right.
And so I think it's important to really assess the relationships and look at what are those ones that are reinforcing the wounded narratives versus are there friendships out there or relationships out there that could offer the reparative narratives. And if not, that's an interesting conversation too, is, a lot of work I think both of us do with clients is how to choose your relationships from not from the wounding, but from the, from what's really true about who you are. And that takes time.
Yeah. I think it can be really hard too when you haven't had the gift of having many healthy relationships.
Right.
And so you kind of recreate these patterns of relationships that don't work.
Yes.
And it just reinforces a belief that relationships don't work and there's no point. And it can feel very, I don't want to say hopeless, but discouraging and feeling like there's no other way that you can have a relationship.
And the relationships don't work. And then whatever that dominant narrative is for you, I'm too much. Right. All of that stuff. It's so important. My rant is really about wanting people to get that it's a story that they've learned about themselves, that they get told about themselves. It doesn't make it true.
Right. Right.
And so one of the things I just love about our friendship is that we're blessed in that your TOO story and my TOO story don't get reinforced with each other. It's a place for, in therapy, we call it corrective emotional experience, where we get to repair that. And you could say it all day long to me that my needs aren't too much or whatever. And I have to be the one who acts on retelling that story.
Right.
It's nice that you offer it, but unless I take ownership of reframing that for myself, I'm going to depend on you to give it to me.
Right. And there is a fine balance because what I'm aware of is that those attachment injuries or whatever those messages that we have, like for me, my I'm too much, that it's still present. And I think the volume gets turned down. And then depending on the situation, so obviously in relationships that I've been in, there's more security, but it may come up like often for the podcasting, because I have a sheet that I send people that are going to be guests. It's 3 pages long. And every time something happens that doesn't work out, I have to add to it. So that brings up my feeling of like, I'm being too much for guests because I'm giving them all this information. So that thought runs through my head and I can go like, well, I do this because I need to. And if they don't read it and they don't like it, like, I can't do anything about that. So I don't know that those thoughts ever totally go away, but how we respond to them changes and how loud and present they are changes.
And you catch it now and you see it rather than being big T truth as like little t and stepping back from it. And I can now challenge that and remind myself of what's going to support me. You have all of these tools now that can assist you in what's really true rather than the lie of the gremlins.
Right.
Yeah.
Laura, thank you so much for being here today. So our 20-year breakup with our mindful reunion.
It's been such a pleasure. And I think I would love to hear if listeners have questions or what it brings up for them to I don't know how to end that sentence. But my hope for them is that it's something that feels hopeful and brings a possibility for them.
Absolutely. And I would love to have Laura back on. We have these incredibly rich conversations that she's busy and schedule-wise it's hard. If you have questions about this episode, please feel free to send them to unapologeticallysensitive@gmail.com. If you have future episodes that you're interested in, if there's stuff that you want us to talk about more, please send me questions. And I'm really about providing content that resonates for each and every one of you. So Laura, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It has been so fun, and what a blessing.
All right. Have a great day. Thank you so much for sticking around and listening to the episode. I wanted to talk about a couple of things. It's really important as therapists, we're all going to have biases, we're all going to make mistakes, but I think it's really important that when the therapist is aware of their bias, they can call attention to that in a really healthy, therapeutic way. Unfortunately, it didn't happen in this situation. We found our way and all is well 20 years later. But I think that when the therapist is able to create a dialogue to discuss conflict or reactions. One of the things that I talk about in this episode is like I would leave therapy. This was an eating disorder therapist, and I would be thinking about what I was going to eat when I left therapy, and I would go and eat because I wasn't getting distress tolerance skills. Like I'd get anxious in therapy, and we weren't really talking about the fact that I was feeling anxious, that I was thinking about food. I didn't know to bring it up to the therapist. And I'm not coming from a place of blaming. I'm coming from a place of awareness. So if these things are going on and you're in therapy, you can bring it up to your therapist. If you're a therapist, are you creating room for these dialogues? How is it for you when you leave therapy? Do you feel like you're coming kind of unglued or undone and we need to get some more tools to help you when therapy is over? Although there were some major shortcomings with this therapist around this whole situation that you just heard about, I really did get a lot out of therapy. I don't think I would be married if I didn't have this therapist because I really spent a lot of time processing about what is a healthy relationship. And as my husband and I were courting, we really did a lot of processing. And then I've shared this before. I didn't want kids. And then I sort of got this baby bug. So I spent a year processing with a therapist about what was coming up and really to feel confident that I had the skills and the awareness to show up for my kids in a very different way than my mom was able to show up for me. No fault, no blame. She was a single parent. She did the best job that she could. You can kind of see how the rules about the rules that I grew up with in my childhood impacted this rupture that I had in my relationship with Laura. So yes, there were some shortcomings in this relationship with the therapist, but it wasn't all bad. And I think that I've probably done this on the podcast. I think it's easy that we vilify therapists or we see things as all good or all bad. It's like our parenting, our marriages, that there are ways that we show up that are really helpful. And then there are areas where we need to grow and do more. So I just wanted to acknowledge that the way that I show up for you in this podcast, the way that I show up as a therapist, the way that I show up as a wife and mother, I've got some amazing strengths. I've done some really, really hard work to work through a lot of trauma, a lot of injury, a lot of ruptures. That's because of the work that I did in therapy. It was my willingness to do that, and it was having therapists that helped me work through a lot of those issues. So it's not always a black and white thing. If any of the things that you heard in this episode resonate with you, if you're struggling with relationships, whether they're friendships or personal relationships, if you're struggling with your traits of being a sensitive or finding out what your strengths are, figuring out how to calm and soothe, I provide online telehealth to people who live in California. We meet on a secure online platform. You can be in the comfort of your home, your office, your car. You can hop on over to patriciayounglcsw.com. We can set up a free consultation. We have an amazing Facebook group called Unapologetically Sensitive. We have this warm, supportive community. If you want to reach out to me, you can go to my website, patriciayounglcsw.com. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for taking time to listen to the show, for sharing it with others. I'm just really appreciative. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Have a blessed day.